Welcome back to the Why We Fight podcast. I'm your host, Justin Stam. This is going to be more of a conversational podcast today. I'm going to go over as much as I can on this subject of Name Zorro, something that's part of my life for at least 23 years, and we tried to get this done as a movie for a long time. It covers the grounds of the conspiratorial, it covers geopolitical, it touches on mafia, but more or less it touches on questions pertinent to constitutional rights and deeper philosophical questions like does the government have the right over your life and so forth. So we're going to dive right in. Codename Zorro is something that I'm known for. It's still on my IMDb, even though I burned the bridge to Hollywood. I don't plan on going back and trying to do especially something like this because they don't want to hear it. Codename Zorro was the code name given to Martin Luther King Jr. In the COINTEL or counterintelligence program, the FBI, who ran domestic intelligence. And when they ran that and they were investigating due to the House of Un-American Activities, which is basically a Senate hearing that investigated over a long period of time, over decades, since after World War I. Different individuals that were involved with radical groups, anarchist groups, communist groups connected to the Soviet Union in some way. And so by the time the formal COINTELPRO program was developed in 56, I believe, that was about the same time that King and the Civil Rights Movement emerged, as we know it. Now, we know that Philip Randolph and others had been involved with the civil rights causes before NAACP and so forth preceded that. But 56, 57, 58 were extremely tantamount points in the whole civil rights movement and the cultural change being pushed by the globalists, by the think tanks, by the deconstructionists, because that's when the Montgomery bus boycott started. That's when the lunch line started, the integrations of the schools. They demanded that the integration of the school began and so forth. So this is a cultural shift, and it didn't happen in the early 60s. It began in the late 50s, mid to late 50s. So codename Zorro, as I came to find out, being Zorro being fox in Spanish, was the codename given to King by the FBI after they followed him and found out about a lot about his personal life. And of course, fox in Spanish means a colloquial term assigned to somebody that is a sexual deviant. And that's what they assigned him as. So, and we'll cover that in a little while, but I'll go over how I developed this whole story, how I ran across it, and the time period that I developed it in. So, and I'll break it down into a few different parts. Now, I will point out, this is very interesting and fortuitous that Tucker Carlson just interviewed this past week Vince Ellison, and he completely eviscerated King and not all, but a lot of the civil rights movement due to the fact that so many were involved both with the Communist Party USA, other Soviet and communist organizations, socialist Marxist organizations. And somebody tries to say they're different, it leads to the same thing, okay? And at the same time, ironically, as a lot of them were also on the payroll of the FBI. So why would that occur? Why would internationalist bodies, and we'll cover this later, but why would internationalist bodies like the Tavistock, like the RAND Corporation, like the intelligence organizations, like the international banks, be involved with even pre-Operation Gladio international operations, as pointed out by Anthony Sutton's book, Wall Street and the Bolshevik Revolution, and how they funded the Bolshevik Revolution, right? And how during the Cold War, Anthony Sutton pointed out and documents in this book with State Department records that we were giving foreign aid to the Soviet Union by the billions. At the peak was about 1976 or 77, in the amount of 40 billion. And these are a lot of the companies, and I've had this is probably printed out in 1999. So this is an appendix of this book before I had this book. And it documents all these companies: Acme, Alice Commerce, American Can Company, American Chain, Dow Chemicals, Douglas Aircraft, Coma Corporation, Ford Motor Corporation, Honeywell, all these companies, Bechtel, why was the U.S. government not only allowing private corporations to have factories in the Soviet Union while we were in a Cold War with them, also while we were at war with North Korea, or I should say the communists in Korea before it became North Korea, and in Vietnam. I mean, Bechtel ended up building roads in Flora Daniel, if I remember right, building roads for Russia, sending over Caterpillar and John Deere parts that got turned into tanks and other types of weapons that were used against our own men. So that's the geopolitical implication there. So that is something that I'll touch on in a little while. So first part is I'm going to explain what the subject of Codename Zorro is about and what the COINTELPRO program is about. The second thing is I'll discuss how I discovered the storyline for the script that I wrote for the screenplay and how it involved William Sullivan. I'll go over also the general overview of the storyline as I wrote it, and that would be this script right here. And some of you guys have seen pictures I've posted on my Twitter feed about this. I've discussed it several times. This was my first draft with all the problems and warts and all. Registered with the Writers Guild Association, of course, 2001. Okay, same year as 9/11 happened, 2001. So this particular script I passed around before I started making more copies, so I've had it for that long. Okay, so I'll go over the storyline in general. I'm going to name my source contacts, which I've never done on this story, and some honorable mentions as well. And the last thing I'm going to go over is what the story really is about and what are the geopolitical implications, something I just touched on a little bit, but I'll go into it more so. So what is Codename Zorro? What is this story about? So I mentioned about Codename Zorro being the name that was given to King. I don't know how early on. Actually, it's not very clear because a lot of the declassified records are still redacted. We know for sure that somebody I mentioned before in another podcast named William Sullivan took over in 1962 or 3. It might have been 61. And he was the head of domestic intelligence and led the COINTELPRO. Now, he did not want to actually go after King. He thought he might have been a good influence, but he didn't know a whole lot about King. He just knew about his public image, his PR. Hoover had already known about it, as well as Alan Belmont and Deloach. And so when Sullivan took over, one of the first things he had to do was follow King and put him under surveillance. And it took about 2 weeks in his own personal words. And he didn't talk about it much in this particular book, My 30 Years in Hoover's FBI. He didn't talk about his personal discretions and his personal habits, meaning King's personal habits. But it did come out in the church committee that I mentioned before too, where he had thought that after following him for a while and listening and surveilling him in private hotel rooms and so forth, that he was a completely degenerate person, one of the most degenerate people he's ever seen. Now, that's not my opinion. That's just what he said on record. And because he took that stance, a lot of people destroyed William Sullivan's character. But did he have a point? And should we conflate that with what King was involved in? And does that really matter? And a lot of people say no. And so we'll go over that. But again, this is not about the civil rights movement. It's not even really about King. This is not a King story. So that's what Codename Zorro was about. Codename Zorro was about the last 10 years that William Sullivan was in the FBI from 61 to 71. He was in there 30 years, but the last 10 years, he was the head of domestic intelligence. He handled all the COINTELPRO. So COINTELPRO was a program that I mentioned was developed in 56 or so, but it did do a lot of good. It did follow around a lot of Russian agents, Soviet assets, Soviet influence, and so forth. And we know that occurred because you had Operation Chaos, Operation Naomi, Operation Artichoke, all these different operations that were infiltrating the university system, the school system, the media. It was very in vogue to study about communism objectively because, or in the 1950s and the early 60s amongst the intellectual circles. And they thought it was really cool to do that because it talked about social injustice, right? And so, uh, because of there was an involvement with the spreading of this isn't really well talked about by a lot of people, but I'll just go into it really quick. Because the intelligence organizations and the Pentagon, the War Department that turned into the DoD, were very much involved with the Soviet Union before World War II. They had a relationship with them. Now we know it went into the Cold War after that, but as I just demonstrated, there was a continuing partnership on a corporate level, on a monetary level, but there was a Cold War, not a hot war, regarding weapons hot and shooting at each other. So how can you have the U.S. government stopping international intelligence that was handled by the CIA, and domestic intelligence that was supposed to be handled by the FBI, where one arm, CIA, was in bed with and cooperating with foreign intelligence? And sometimes under Operation Gladio and Underworld, working with mafia and Marxist socialist revolutionaries, and at other times propping up fascist organizations, right? It's a huge chess game. I won't go into all of it, but it's important to know that that actually occurred. Now, domestically, it was hard for the CIA to operate, or any other organization to operate on U.S. soil without having an attachment with a domestic agency. A domestic agency didn't have to be FBI. Oftentimes it was a local sheriff, local police, and it could have happened. And it did happen. We know that with like the meta drug operation and so forth. So how that affected the domestic operations in America was that the culture changed that Hoover's FBI was fighting because he was more conservative, no matter what his personal life was like. He was still part of a general organization with the stonecutter groups to move America and move the West towards a gradual outcome of ecumenism, of a libertarian-style neoconservative type of world, right? So it's just gradual revolution rather than rapid revolution. And the butting of the heads between the intelligence organizations of the CIA and the FBI happened a lot because the CIA oftentimes did not ask. And it got to such a bad point where the FBI would stop domestic illegal operations, and they would actually be forced into I forgot the name of the organization, but basically it was a shared intelligence board. And NSA, CIA, Army intelligence, Naval intelligence, Air Force intelligence all had a conference room where they would sit there from the same year that William Sullivan became the head of the Domestic Intelligence Division, Division 5, I think it was. Ironically, Hoover never showed up for those meetings, and it was Sullivan that always showed up. And as a side point, it was kind of funny because once the conference room was created, and I think it was held at the Pentagon, all the different intelligence agencies had their symbols, had their signs, their medallions on the walls behind the seat of every department head that was there. But Hoover made sure that the FBI was the head of the meeting and therefore had the largest, like a grotesquely bigger medallion that would sit behind the chair of where Sullivan would sit. So that's just a side point. So that's what you're dealing with. So when I asked the question, what is Codename Zorro? Codename Zorro was more than just King. There were arrests. There were Russian agents that were arrested. But as Sullivan pointed out, he pointed out that he did not actually think that the Soviet foreign operations in America were that much of a threat. He documented how oftentimes they would arrest Soviet agents and let them go not too long after that. He actually thought, and he butted heads with Hoover on this, and it shows you that Sullivan was not part of the secret orders. He was not part of the secret fraternities like Hoover was. Hoover was a stonecutter. He was a first degree and a 32nd degree, and he got his 33rd degree and 32nd by blackmailing different politicians in Washington, D.C. to force their hand for his promotion. Whereas before he was suppressed because he had used a lot of dirt on others. Because, look, Hoover ran the FBI for, I believe, 50 years. And the FBI was the single federal agency that vetted every federal employee, whether it's the Pentagon, FBI, CIA, anybody that's a federal employee would have to do a background check. And that involved directly a dossier built on every federal employee by Hoover. Now, you would think it would be because you have to do a background check to make sure they're okay, they're not a felon, they don't have any history of problems, and so forth. But the way Hoover used it, he began building a dossier in case he needed anybody to be used as an asset later in life. So one guy that's a junior agent one day could be the division head the next day, and you would need something out of him. And that's how he used all the information that he gathered on people. It was actually pretty genius how he did it. Kind of marvel at his entire architecture. And so again, that's how we established the story of Codename Zorro. And I'm going to say it again, it's not about the civil rights movement. It's not about King, although I had to delve very deeply into the entire history of the civil rights movement and all the organizations. And that leads me to the second point I'm going to make, what it is not. It's not about King.